There is a private letter written by John D. Rockefeller in the summer of 1888 in which he refers to one of the products his refineries produced as, and I am quoting now, that troublesome distillate which we are not yet able to sell at any price worth recording. The letter is addressed to his partner Henry Flagler. The product Rockefeller is describing is gasoline. He is, in the summer of 1888, in the position of a man who has accidentally produced, as a waste byproduct of his real business, the substance that will, within 20 years, become the most valuable industrial commodity on earth. He does not know this. No one in 1888 knows this. The automobile has not yet been invented in any commercially recognizable form. The product Rockefeller is paid for is kerosene, for lamps, for reading by, for warming rooms in winter. Gasoline is the thin, volatile liquid that comes off the top of the distillation column and that no one wants. He pours it into the Cuyahoga River.
He burns it in pits. He sells it, when he can, to small chemical firms for cleaning fluids. He prices it in his own ledgers at 1.5 cents per gallon, well below the cost of producing it. He is throwing away every week the substance that will, in retrospect, be the largest missed opportunity in the entire history of his career. The conservative estimate of what that miss cost the Rockefeller fortune, measured in present-day dollars, is approximately $50 billion. This is a story about how the most disciplined operator in the history of American capitalism, a man who, by every contemporary account, missed nothing, anticipated everything, and refused to be surprised by the structure of any market he entered, looked directly at the product that would define the 20th century and failed to see it. The failure was not, in the conventional sense, a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of imagination. He saw gasoline as a problem. He did not see that the problem was waiting for a different question.
When the question arrived, the automobile, the internal combustion engine, the moving assembly line, the answer was already in his refineries and had been for 30 years, and he had been giving it away. The refining process in 1870 was crude in the engineering sense as well as the literary one. Crude oil, drawn from wells in Pennsylvania, was a thick, brownish liquid containing dozens of hydrocarbons of varying volatility. The refinery boiled the crude in a closed still, and as the temperature rose, different fractions evaporated, condensed in cooling coils, and ran off into collection barrels. The most volatile fraction came off first, at temperatures between roughly 40 and 200 degrees Celsius. This fraction was light, clear, and intensely flammable. It was called, depending on the refinery and the year, naphtha, benzene, or gasoline. There was no use for it. Lamps that burned it tended to explode.
The chemical industry of the 1870s was small and could not absorb the volume produced. Most refineries simply dumped it into nearby waterways. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, downstream of the Standard Oil refineries, was famously flammable for decades. It caught fire 13 times between 1868 and 1969, and the early fires were almost entirely fueled by Standard Oil's gasoline runoff. The middle fraction, coming off between roughly 200 and 300 degrees Celsius, was kerosene. This was the product. This was the entire business. Kerosene burned cleanly in the household lamps that had, by 1880, replaced whale oil and candles in every middle-class American home. A gallon of kerosene gave a lamp roughly 14 hours of useful light. The kerosene business in 1880 was worth, in modern dollars, approximately $1.5 billion annually in the United States alone. Standard Oil controlled 90% of it. The heaviest fraction, coming off above 300 degrees, was a mixture of lubricating oils, paraffins, and asphalt. These had specialized industrial uses: machine lubrication, candle making, road surfacing, and were profitable in modest quantities. The economics of the refinery were, therefore,
structured around kerosene. Every gallon of gasoline produced was, in effect, a deduction from the kerosene margin. The refinery was paid to make kerosene. It was forced, by the chemistry of distillation, to produce gasoline as well. The gasoline was a tax on the kerosene business, paid in the form of disposal costs, regulatory headaches, and the occasional refinery fire. This was the world in which Rockefeller operated with absolute mastery for 30 years. There are several letters in the Rockefeller archive in which the future of gasoline is discussed, by Rockefeller himself or by his closest partners, in terms that are now painful to read.
The earliest is a memorandum from 1882, written by the chief chemist of Standard Oil's Cleveland refinery, a man named Herman Frasch, to the executive committee. Frasch was an unusually capable industrial scientist who would later develop the process for desulfurizing crude oil that bears his name. In the memorandum he writes, and I am reading directly from the document, which is preserved at the Rockefeller Archive Center, he writes, "The light naphtha fraction continues to accumulate at the Cleveland and Bayonne works in quantities for which we have no profitable disposition. I have considered, at the direction of Mr. Rockefeller, whether any future use might be found for this material. My current view is that no such use is foreseeable. The material is too volatile for illumination, too coarse for the chemical trades, and too dangerous for general distribution. I recommend that we continue to dispose of it by the present methods, and that we explore, where possible, modifications to the distillation process that would reduce the yield of this fraction." Read that paragraph twice. The chief chemist of the largest petroleum company in the world is, in 1882, recommending that the company modify its refining process to produce less gasoline. He is recommending the active destruction of capacity in the product that will, in his lifetime, become the company's most valuable output. A second letter from Rockefeller himself to Flagler, dated November of 1893, contains a passage that, when read with the benefit of hindsight, is harder still. Rockefeller writes, "I observe with some interest the recent reports from Germany of the experimental carriage propelled by an internal combustion engine, the so-called Benz machine. The fuel used is, as I understand it, a fraction of refined petroleum similar to our light naphtha."
If the machine should become more than a curiosity, which I do not expect given the obvious dangers of carrying volatile fuel in a vehicle of such design, there might be a small market for our surplus product. I have asked Mr. Frasch to inquire further. Rockefeller is, in 1893, looking directly at the early automobile. He is correctly identifying the fuel it uses. He is acknowledging that this might create a market for the surplus product he has been throwing away. And he is, in the same sentence, dismissing the prospect because he expects the automobile not to succeed. He was wrong about almost nothing in his career. He was wrong about this. Why was he wrong when he was so rarely wrong about anything else? The answer is structural, and it reveals something important about the limits of even the most disciplined operator. There are 3 reasons a person who is otherwise correct about almost everything fails on a question like this one. The 3 reasons compound. First,
the mental model that produced the original success is precisely the model that prevents recognition of the new opportunity. Rockefeller built Standard Oil around a single product, kerosene, and a single use case, illumination. Every decision he made for 30 years, every refinery built, every pipeline laid, every distribution agreement signed, every competitor acquired, was structured around the kerosene business. The mental model was not merely a strategy, it was the architecture of his attention. When a new question appeared in the world, what if there were a use for the volatile light fraction other than disposal?
The question entered his mind through the filter of the kerosene model. The question was therefore translated automatically into a kerosene-relevant form. How much will gasoline reduce the price of kerosene by competing for the same end use? The translation was wrong. Gasoline was not going to compete with kerosene.
Gasoline was going to operate in a different category entirely, transportation rather than illumination, and the kerosene model had no aperture through which the new category could be seen. Second, the personal incentives of the operator align against attention to the new opportunity. The senior management of Standard Oil in the 1890s, Rockefeller, Flagler, Archbold, Rogers, and a handful of others, were already extraordinarily wealthy. The marginal dollar of their fortunes was less interesting to them than the marginal risk to the existing fortune. A speculative investment in a new fuel market for a new transportation technology represented exactly the kind of exposure that mature wealth most rationally avoids. The existing business was producing a 30% annual return on capital. The new business would have required, in its early stages, capital expenditure with no certain return. Rational allocation from inside the kerosene model was to ignore it. Third, the information environment of the senior operator filters out signals from outside the existing business. By 1890, Rockefeller's direct contact with the petroleum industry was mediated by a small staff of senior partners, a handful of lawyers, and a private secretary. New information reached him only through these channels. None of these channels were tuned to detect emerging applications of waste products. The chemist Frosch was paid to improve kerosene. The lawyers were paid to defend the trust. The secretary was paid to manage the calendar. There was no one in the room whose specific function was to ask, "What is the world doing with the parts of our business we are not paying attention to?" These three components, the locked model, the misaligned incentives, the filtered information, produce a structural blindness that even the most capable operator cannot overcome by effort alone. The blindness is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of having succeeded at scale by means of a specific model. It would be unfair to Rockefeller to leave the matter there, because there is a defense, and the defense has some force. The defense runs as follows. In 1893, when Rockefeller wrote the dismissive letter about the Benz machine, the automobile was not, in any meaningful sense, a product. It was a curiosity. There were perhaps a few dozen functioning internal combustion vehicles in the world. The technology was unreliable, the price was prohibitive, the roads did not exist, the fuel distribution network did not exist, and the public's relationship to mechanical transportation was based on steam engines, which had been improving for a century without ever displacing the horse for personal transport. To expect Rockefeller in 1893 to anticipate that this curiosity would, within 25 years, become the dominant form of personal transportation in the wealthy world would be to require of him a kind of foresight that no contemporary observer demonstrated. Furthermore, the defense continues, Rockefeller did not, in fact, miss the gasoline opportunity entirely. By 1905, when automobile sales were beginning to accelerate, Standard Oil was producing gasoline at scale, selling it through dedicated stations, and earning meaningful revenue from it. By 1911, when the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of the trust, gasoline accounted for approximately 20% of Standard Oil's revenue, a smaller share than kerosene, but a significant one. The successor companies, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, would, over the following century, become the dominant gasoline producers in the world. The fortune that flowed from gasoline did, in the end, reach Rockefeller's heirs. It just did not reach them through a position of overwhelming dominance comparable to the kerosene monopoly. The defense, in summary, is that Rockefeller's failure to anticipate the automobile in 1893 was a failure shared by every reasonable observer in 1893, and that the company he built was flexible enough to capture significant gasoline revenue once the automobile actually emerged. The $50 billion counterfactual, the figure cited at the top of this video, is therefore a theoretical loss measured against a benchmark of impossible foresight, not a real loss measured against achievable performance. This defense is fair. It is also, in a deeper sense, the whole point. The mistake was not that he failed to predict the automobile. The mistake was that he had built an enterprise that, even when the automobile arrived, could not adapt with the speed required to capture the new market with the same dominance it had captured the old one. The kerosene model produced the fortune. The kerosene model also produced the constraint. He could not move into gasoline as a monopolist because the gasoline market emerged in a different political and regulatory environment, one in which antitrust enforcement, public scrutiny, and competitor capital were all dramatically more aggressive than they had been in the 1870s. By the time gasoline mattered, the techniques that had built Standard Oil were no longer available to Standard Oil. The structural blindness Rockefeller demonstrated in the 1890s is the same blindness that is repeated in different costumes in every subsequent generation of dominant industrial firms. Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975. The inventor was a young engineer named Stephen Sasson, working in Kodak's research laboratory. He built a prototype that captured an image on a magnetic cassette at a resolution of 100 by 100 pixels in 23 seconds. He showed the prototype to Kodak's senior management. They congratulated him politely. They asked him not to discuss the project externally. They put the patent in a drawer. The reasoning, recorded in internal memoranda that were later made public during Kodak's bankruptcy proceedings in 2012, was that digital photography would, if commercialized, cannibalize Kodak's film business. The film business was, at that time, producing a 40% gross margin and generating roughly 70% of Kodak's revenue. The decision to suppress the new technology was, from inside the film model, entirely rational. From outside the model, it was the largest single act of corporate self-destruction in the history of American business. IBM dismissed the personal computer in the late 1970s as a hobbyist toy, and then, when forced to enter the market, outsourced the operating system to a small company in Seattle called Microsoft. The reasoning, again, was structural. IBM's business was mainframe computing. The mainframe model could not accommodate the personal computer model. The personal computer market eventually became larger than the mainframe market by an order of magnitude. The operating system that IBM declined to develop became the foundation of the largest software company in the world. Microsoft, in turn, dismissed the smartphone as a toy in 2007. The CEO, Steve Ballmer, told reporters that the iPhone had no chance of getting significant market share. By 2014, the smartphone market was several times the size of the desktop computer market, and Microsoft had effectively no position in it. The reasoning, again, was structural. Microsoft's business was desktop software. The smartphone model could not accommodate the desktop model. The mistake was repeated by a different company in a different decade against a different product with mathematical precision. In each case, the firm that missed the new technology was not run by stupid people. It was run by people whose mental models had been calibrated by long success to a market that was being displaced. The blindness was not a personal failing. It was a structural feature of the position they occupied. Rockefeller's gasoline miss is the prototype. Every subsequent miss of comparable structure, Kodak, IBM, Microsoft, Nokia, Blockbuster, replicates the pattern. The successful operator builds a model around a product. The model becomes the architecture of attention. A new product appears,
in a category the model does not recognize. The model interprets the new product through the lens of the old category. The interpretation is wrong. The opportunity is missed. The firm continues to perform well at the old business, while quietly losing the future. Let us do the arithmetic of the counterfactual carefully, so the $50 billion figure can be understood for what it is. In 1911, when Standard Oil was dissolved, the trust held approximately 90% of American refining capacity, but, in gasoline specifically, only about 60% of motor fuel production. The remaining 40% had been captured during the 1900 to 1911 period by independent operators. Texaco, founded in 1901, Gulf Oil, founded in 1907, and a number of smaller competitors who had recognized the automotive opportunity earlier and moved into it more aggressively. Had Standard Oil applied to gasoline the same monopolistic discipline it had applied to kerosene, vertical integration, rate discrimination, predatory pricing of competitors, secret agreements with railroads, the trust would, by the most plausible reconstruction, have held 90% of the motor fuel market as well by 1911.
The additional 30% of the market, captured at the gross margins typical of Standard Oil operations, would have generated, between 1900 and 1911, additional revenue of approximately $140 million in then current terms. But that figure is the small part of the counterfactual. The large part is what the compounding of that additional revenue would have produced over the subsequent century. Standard Oil's successor companies, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and the others, became over the 20th century among the largest corporations in the world. The combined market capitalization of those successor companies, at their collective peak around 2008, was approximately $1.5 trillion. Rockefeller's heirs and trusts held, throughout this period, declining but still substantial positions in the successor companies. Their combined wealth at the 2008 peak was approximately $10 billion in liquid holdings.
Had the gasoline opportunity been captured with the same dominance as kerosene, the successor companies would have been larger by approximately 30%, and the Rockefeller family holdings, before disposition through philanthropy and estate division, would have been larger by approximately the same proportion. The additional wealth, compounded over a century and adjusted for inflation, is the figure that produces the $50 billion estimate. It is a counterfactual. It cannot be verified. It assumes the regulatory environment of 1880 had persisted into the 1910s, which it did not. And it assumes a level of foresight in 1893 that no contemporary actor demonstrated. But the calculation is not arbitrary. It is the difference between the world that produced the actual Rockefeller fortune and the world in which the same operator, with the same discipline, had recognized the new product category 20 years earlier. The miss was real. The cost of the miss was real.
The figure is conservative. The volatile liquid was poured into the river. The chemist Frosch recommended modifying the process to produce less of it. Rockefeller, in his correspondence, called it troublesome. The river caught fire repeatedly. A man in Germany, working in a small workshop, was at the same time fitting a small internal combustion engine to a three-wheeled carriage. He had no connection to the petroleum industry. He had no funding from any of the major oil companies. He was working alone, with a few mechanics, on a project that almost no one in the world thought would matter. The two stories, the dumped gasoline in Cleveland and the experimental carriage in Mannheim, did not, in the 1880s and 1890s, appear to be the same story. To Rockefeller, they were entirely separate categories of fact. The Benz machine was a curiosity. The gasoline was a waste product. There was no reason, from inside the kerosene model, to suspect that they were the two halves of a single answer. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Somewhere in your own field, in your own industry, in your own work,
There is a thing being produced, or thrown away, or dismissed, or sold for less than it costs to make. And somewhere else, in another field, in another industry, a small group of people is working on something that is also currently a curiosity, also currently unprofitable, also currently dismissed. The two stories from inside your model do not appear to be the same story. Are you sure?